Austrians versus Austrians. This one is considered by many to be the worst friendly fire incident in history, and it happened because of alcohol. In September 1788, during the Austro-Turkish War, the Austrian army went through the Battle of Karansebes. The Austrian troops were camped near the town of Karansebes, in what is now Romania, and part of the army, around 100,000 soldiers, was sent ahead to look for the Ottoman enemy. A group of them crossed a river but didn't find the enemy. Instead, they met some Romani people who offered them alcohol. Later, some more Austrian soldiers also crossed the river and asked for alcohol. But the first group, who was already drinking, refused and set up a defensive position around the alcohol. This led to an argument and someone fired a shot. A fight then broke out between the two Austrian groups. Things got worse very quickly. In the confusion, someone shouted, "Turks! Turks!" in Romanian, and panic spread through the troops. Keep in mind that many soldiers came from different ethnic groups and couldn't understand each other. They started running in all directions, and officers tried to stop them by shouting, "Halt! Halt!" in German. But some soldiers thought they were hearing Allah, Allah, and believed the Ottomans were attacking. As the scared soldiers ran back through their own camp, General Colloredo thought it was a real enemy attack and ordered the artillery to fire, killing and wounding a lot of his own soldiers. 2 days after this disaster, the real Ottoman army arrived. They found dead and wounded soldiers, and they took Karansebes without any fighting. No one knows exactly how many Austrians died. Some reports say 150 were killed, and others say more than 1,000 were wounded. The Xhosa Prophet. In 1856, a teenage Xhosa girl named Nonkawuse said she had received a message from the spirits of her ancestors. They told her that the Xhosa people must kill all their cattle and destroy their crops. At the time, many cattle were already dying from a disease called lung sickness, and she said that the spirits promised that if the Xhosa followed these instructions, the dead would rise, healthy cattle would appear, crops would grow again, and the European colonizers would be gone. Nonkawuse's uncle, Malakaza, who was a spiritual leader and former Christian convert, believed her. He shared the message with Chief Sarhili, who soon ordered the people to obey. Over the next year, the Xhosa killed around 400,000 cattle and stopped planting food. The miracle never happened. By early 1858, the prophecy had failed, and around 40,000 people died of hunger. Many others had to go to the British-controlled Cape Colony to find food and work. The British governor, George Grey, used the disaster to take more Xhosa land, and he forced many people into hard labor and allowed settlers to farm on the seized land. This event was basically the end of major Xhosa resistance and helped the British gain more control in the region. Radcliffe's Partition of India. In 1947, the British decided to end their rule in India and to divide the land into two new countries, India and Pakistan. A British lawyer named Sir Cyril Radcliffe was given the job of drawing the new border, which would have become known as the Radcliffe Line. The aim was to separate areas with Muslim majorities, which would join Pakistan, from areas with Hindu and Sikh majorities, which would stay in India. The Muslim League supported this idea, but the Indian National Congress wanted India to remain united. When talks between the two sides failed and violence began to spread, many leaders believed that dividing the country was the only way to avoid a full civil war. So the last British ruler in India, Lord Mountbatten, moved the date of independence forward to August 1947. But this gave very little time to organize the complex separation. Sir Cyril Radcliffe had never been to India and was given only a few weeks to draw the new borders using maps and population data. The final border was not announced until August 17, 1947, 2 days after India and Pakistan became independent. So, millions of people did not know which country they were in when independence was declared. The new border cut through homes, villages, and farms, causing confusion and fear. This led to one of the biggest and most violent migrations in human history. Between 12 and 20 million people were forced to leave their homes. Muslims moved toward Pakistan, and Hindus and Sikhs moved toward India. The journey was very dangerous, as there were many violent attacks on both sides. Between several 100,000 and 2 million people were killed. There were also terrible stories of massacres, torture, and the kidnapping of tens of thousands of women. Trofim Lysenko. Trofim Lysenko was a Soviet agricultural scientist who became very powerful under the rule of Joseph Stalin. He rejected the science of genetics, which is based on the work of Gregor Mendel, and the idea that traits are passed through genes. Instead, Lysenko believed that traits learned during a plant's or animal's life could be passed on to their offspring. For example, he said that exposing wheat seeds to cold would make future plants more resistant to cold. He also claimed that plants of the same type would help each other grow instead of competing for food. These ideas had no scientific proof, but he was good at gaining political support. Since his theories promised quick results during a time of food shortages, Stalin and the Communist Party strongly supported him, and in 1940, Lysenko became the director of the Soviet Union's Institute of Genetics. This gave him control over all biology research in the country. He used his power to attack real genetic science, and scientists who disagreed with him were fired. Many were sent to prison, and some, like the famous plant scientist Nikolai Vavilov, died in jail. Making Lysenko's ideas the official policy had terrible results. He forced farmers to use his unproven methods, like planting seeds very close together, because he believed they wouldn't compete. These methods failed, causing crop disasters and contributing to famines that killed millions of people in the Soviet Union. Lysenko's influence even spread to China in 1958, where his ideas helped cause the Great Chinese Famine, which also led to millions of deaths. After Stalin died, Lysenko began to lose power, and scientists like Andrei Sakharov openly criticized him as a fraud who damaged Soviet science. Lysenko was finally removed from his position in 1965, but he had already caused millions of deaths by that point. Training Mamluk slaves. The Mamluks were originally enslaved people from non-Arab backgrounds who, from the 9th century, were brought into the Islamic world and trained to become elite soldiers. Over time, however, they didn't just become good soldiers for their Islamic owners, but they became a powerful and independent military class, especially in Egypt. In 1250, they took control and ruled Egypt and Syria as the Mamluk Sultanate, which lasted until 1517. During this time, they defeated the Crusaders and pushed them out of the region, and they also won major battles against the Mongols. Even after the Ottoman Empire conquered Egypt in 1517, the Ottomans kept Mamluks as local rulers and military leaders. They remained in positions of power until 1811. Manzikert's Mercenaries. In 1071, Byzantine Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes led a large army to take back land in eastern Anatolia that had been lost to the Seljuk Turks. His army included professional soldiers and many mercenaries from inside and outside the empire, including Turkic fighters. But of course, many of these foreign troops had little loyalty to the Byzantine Empire. This would become a major problem. Romanos split his army and sent part of it to capture a nearby fortress, but that group never returned, so his army was much smaller than planned. He then decided to march towards the town of Manzikert, which he easily took, but the Seljuks began using hit-and-run attacks with horse archers, which hurt Byzantine morale and made the army tired and confused. On the day of the battle, the Byzantines advanced, but when they tried to pull back in the evening, a general named Andronikos Doukas from a rival noble family ignored Romanos' orders and left the battlefield. This made many soldiers panic and flee. Some blamed the Armenians for deserting first, while others said they fought bravely. The only troops that clearly stayed loyal to Romanos were his personal bodyguards and some Armenian infantry who suffered heavy losses. The Seljuks surrounded the remaining Byzantine troops and captured Emperor Romanos. This was a shocking event because no Roman emperor had ever been taken alive by a Muslim leader. Romanos was released, but when he returned home, he found that his enemies had taken over. The powerful Doukas family removed him from power, blinded him, and sent him into exile. He died soon after, and in the years that followed, the Byzantines lost large areas of land that they would never get back. Dred Scott decision. In 1857, the United States Supreme Court made a decision in the case of Dred Scott versus Sanford that had a huge impact on the country. Dred Scott was an enslaved man whose owner, Dr. John Emerson, had taken him from Missouri, a slave state, to live in Illinois and Wisconsin, both free states. After Emerson died, Scott asked Emerson's widow, Irene, to let him buy his freedom, but she refused. With help from lawyers, Scott went to court, saying he had become free because he had lived on free land, and the case eventually reached the Supreme Court. The court ruled against Scott in a 7-2 decision, saying that people of African descent, whether they were enslaved or free, could not be U.S. citizens. Because of that, the court said Scott had no right to sue in federal court. It then also argued that slaves were property and that the Fifth Amendment protected a person's property. This made them say that the Missouri Compromise of 1820 was unconstitutional. This law was a compromise between northern states, which wanted to stop slavery from spreading, and southern states, which wanted it to grow. But now, according to the court, Congress had no right to stop slave owners from bringing slaves into U.S. territories. This meant that slavery could legally expand into any part of the country, even in the free states. People in the North were outraged, and the decision made it nearly impossible to find political compromise and gave more power to the anti-slavery movement. It helped the new Republican Party grow stronger, especially its rising leader, Abraham Lincoln. The Dred Scott decision brought the country much closer to the Civil War, which began just 4 years later. Bush's decision. In 2003, when a group of countries led by the United States invaded Iraq, US President George W. Bush and UK Prime Minister Tony Blair said the goals were to remove weapons of mass destruction, stop Saddam Hussein's support for terrorism, and free the Iraqi people. The US government also claimed that Saddam had ties to the terrorist group Al-Qaeda, which carried out the 9/11 attacks. Before the war began, United Nations inspectors said they had not found any signs that Iraq still had active weapons of mass destruction programs, and some important US allies, such as France and Germany, strongly opposed the invasion. Later on, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan said the invasion was illegal under international law. The invasion started on March 20th, 2003, with airstrikes on Iraq's capital, Baghdad. About 160,000 coalition troops entered Iraq from Kuwait, and the invasion happened quickly, using a strategy called shock and awe to overwhelm Iraq's weaker military. US forces took control of Baghdad on April 9th, and Saddam Hussein and his government went into hiding. On May 1st, 2003, President Bush declared that major fighting was over, but no weapons of mass destruction were found, and the reasons given for the war were later shown to be based on false or weak intelligence. The entire situation created chaos in Iraq. There was widespread looting, a deadly insurgency, and years of violence between different religious and political groups. Around this time, trust in the news started to decline, as some sided with Bush while others went against him. Nowadays, distrust in mainstream media is at one of its highest points ever, but thankfully, we have platforms like Ground News, today's sponsor. Let's take a look at this article about the talks between Iran and Europe, as Iran is also being accused of developing nuclear facilities to create weapons of mass destruction. We can see that 243 sources reported on this, but only 19% of them were right-leaning. That might make it a blind spot for people who usually follow right-leaning sources. We can also compare how different outlets report the story. This right-leaning article says the talks were tense, while this left-leaning one says the bloc needs to take the diplomatic lead or be swayed by the illusion that might makes right. One of my favorite features is the blind spot feed, which highlights stories underreported by one side of the political spectrum, like the one we just looked at. Basically, instead of just telling you one version of a story, Ground News brings together coverage from all sides so you can make up your own mind. You can get access to all of this at ground.news/TPE or scan my QR code to get 40% off the same top-tier Vantage plan I use for unlimited access. Thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring this video. Diocletian's split. In the late 3rd century, the Roman Empire was in serious trouble, as it was too large, unstable, and constantly facing attacks from outside enemies and rebellions from within. This period is known as the Crisis of the 3rd century. In 284, a military leader named Diocletian became emperor, and seeing that the empire was too big and had too many problems for one person to rule alone, he shared his power. In 286, he made a trusted officer, Maximian, his co-emperor. Diocletian ruled the eastern half of the empire, while Maximian ruled the western half. Then, in 293, Diocletian expanded this system into what is called the Tetrarchy, or Rule of Four. Each emperor chose a junior emperor to help rule. Diocletian chose Galerius for the east, and Maximian chose Constantius for the west. Each of the four rulers had their own part of the empire, their own court, and their own army. This made it easier to respond quickly to problems in different areas, and for a while, this new structure worked well. The Tetrarchy brought peace, protected the borders, and ended the crisis. But it did have a big weakness. In 305, Diocletian became sick and did something no Roman emperor had ever done before. He retired. He wanted the two junior emperors to become the new emperors, but the system quickly fell apart. The sons of the former emperors were left out of the plan, and they began to fight for control, starting new civil wars. The eastern and western parts started to grow apart, with different cultures and goals. This division weakened the empire and helped lead to the fall of the Western Roman Empire about 150 years later. Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. In 1978, a communist party, the PDPA, took power in Afghanistan, and its leaders tried to force modern changes on a traditional and religious society. Many Afghans rejected these reforms, and armed groups called the Mujahideen began a rebellion. The official Afghan army was weak and losing control, so the government asked the Soviet Union for help. At first, Soviet leaders, including Leonid Brezhnev, refused because they feared getting stuck in a long war. But by the end of 1979, they worried the Afghan government would collapse. They were also afraid that a new Islamic government, like the one in Iran, could rise on their border. The Soviets also believed that Prime Minister Amin might be secretly working with the US. They decided on a quick mission to remove Amin, replace him with a more moderate leader named Babrak Karmal, and restore control. In December 1979, Soviet special forces entered the capital, Kabul, killed Amin, and made Karmal the new leader. Instead of calming the country, the invasion made resistance stronger. Afghan nationalism grew, and the Mujahideen gained even more fighters. Just like they feared, the war became long and brutal. The Soviets held the cities, but the Mujahideen controlled most of the mountains and rural areas. They used guerrilla tactics with small, fast attacks, and they were hard to defeat. The Soviet army responded with heavy bombing, destroyed villages, and planted millions of landmines. The US, the main enemy of the Soviet Union, sent billions of dollars in weapons and money to the Mujahideen through a secret CIA program called Operation Cyclone. The war cost the Soviet Union a lot of money and lives, which is why it's been called the Soviet Union's Vietnam. By the mid-1980s, the new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, decided to end the war. After years of talks, the last Soviet troops left in February 1989, but the war had already caused huge damage. Up to 3 million Afghans died, and millions more became refugees. About 15,000 Soviet soldiers were killed. The defeat hurt the Soviet Union's image and economy, and it is seen as one of the reasons the Soviet Union collapsed just 2 years later. After the Soviets left, the Afghan government fell in 1992, and the Mujahideen groups began fighting each other in a new civil war. Louis XV's donations to America. Louis XV became King of France when the country was already weak, especially after losing many colonies to Britain in the 7 Years' War. He wanted to restore France's power and saw a chance to do that by supporting the American colonies in their fight for independence against Britain. France sent weapons and money to the American rebels, officially joined the war in 1778, and helped win a key battle at Yorktown in 1781. But the war cost France a lot of money, and when it ended in 1783, France gained little in return. Inside France, things were getting worse, as war debt, poor harvests, and bad finances created a crisis. In 1789, angry crowds forced the king and his family to leave Versailles and live in Paris. A constitutional monarchy was created, and Louis promised to support it. However, he secretly worked with foreign powers and royal supporters to stop the revolution. In 1791, he tried to escape to Austria, but was caught in Varennes and brought back. This failed escape made many people lose trust in him and pushed more people to support a republic. By 1792, other European kings were worried that revolution might spread to their countries, and they prepared to fight France. When a statement called the Brunswick Manifesto warned the French people not to harm the king, it made things worse. On the 10th of August 1792, French revolutionaries attacked the Tuileries Palace and ended the monarchy. Louis was put in prison, tried for treason, and found guilty. On the 21st of January 1793, Louis XV was executed by guillotine. His death marked the end of the French monarchy and the rise of revolutionaries. The Russian Campaign. In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Russia with the goal to force the Russian Emperor, Alexander I, to stop trading with Great Britain, which was France's main enemy. To do this, Napoleon gathered the Grande Armée, a huge army of nearly 500,000 soldiers from many different countries, the largest Europe had ever seen. The invasion began in June. Napoleon thought he would win quickly, but the Russian army, led by generals like Mikhail Kutuzov, avoided big battles. Instead, they kept retreating deeper into Russia, and as they pulled back, they destroyed crops, food, and villages, leaving nothing for the French army to use. This was known as the scorched earth tactic. Napoleon's army expected to live off the land, but they found little food, and even before any major battles, thousands of French soldiers were dying from hunger, exhaustion, and disease. When the first big battle happened at Borodino in September, it was extremely bloody, and both sides lost many men. The Russians retreated again, allowing Napoleon to enter Moscow on September 14th, but it too was nearly empty and had been set on fire. Napoleon waited 5 weeks for Alexander I to offer peace, but no offer came. As winter neared, Napoleon had to retreat. He tried to take a different route through untouched land, but Russian forces blocked him. He was forced to return along the same path he had used to invade, which had already been destroyed. In early November, the harsh Russian winter began. Napoleon's troops still wore summer uniforms and had no food. Cold, snow, and ice killed many. Russian peasants and fighters attacked the weak French army as it tried to escape. One of the worst moments was the crossing of the Berezina River, where thousands more soldiers died. On December 5th, Napoleon left his army and rushed back to Paris. The invasion of Russia was one of the greatest military disasters in history. Of the nearly 500,000 soldiers who went in, fewer than 120,000 came out, and many of them were really sick or injured. The defeat destroyed the Grande Armée and ruined Napoleon's image as an unbeatable general. It was a turning point in the Napoleonic Wars, leading to a new alliance of enemies against him and, in the end, to his fall and exile. If you liked this video, subscribe for similar ones or join my Discord to suggest another.